PostClassical Period from 680 to 1450 AD. In the Middle East, the Islamic empires, which included some of the Byzantine Empire, which was the Eastern Roman Empire, came into power. The Muslims were the primary group that occupied these areas back then and still do today. It started with 4 caliphs, of course, beginning with Muhammad, and eventually the Umayyad Empire took over, and after them, the Abbasid Empire. In South Asia, it was Indians once again, and they kind of just ruled during this time. There wasn't extremely high amounts of centralization during this time. And in the Americas, Mesoamerica consisted of the Toltecs and the Aztecs, who were different groups that ruled during this time in and around Mexico. And for the Andes Mountains, the Incas started to come into power during this time as well. So just a quick map. The Muslims were able to control basically all of previously held Persia, plus more parts of North Africa as well. The Indians, it was primarily separated into 2 places, primarily the south down on the bottom and the north. So it divided India, or South Asia. And once again, the same indigenous people kind of live as they did before. Eventually, these places started to fall as well. For the Umayyads, it was because of weakness and corruption, while the Abbasids had problems tax collecting, so they kind of went bankrupt. Also, these places suffered from shifting trade routes, so different traders in Europe and Asia wanted to find different routes, such as through oceans, so they wouldn't have to pay taxes or go through the tough conditions of the Middle East anymore. Also, invaders, a whole host of them came through, such as the Malik Seljuks, Crusaders, and Mongols especially, started to take over the Muslim empires. For South Asia, there was internal revolts and fighting princesses and princes, and also Muslims and Mongols, once again, who tried to come in and take over the lands. As seen very frequently in world history, if people don't centralize, they really quickly fall to outside invaders. In the Americas, they generally had low technology and also some internal revolts and civil wars, and they weren't really developed as the rest of the world because they couldn't diffuse technology to them or from them. They were separated by 2 big oceans. Eventually, though, at the end of this, the Spanish started to come in and they started to conquer. Cortez took over. He was from the Spanish, and he took over the Aztecs, while for the Incas, Pizarro came over and took over the Andes Mountains for the Spanish as well. And eventually, for these 2 conquistadors, or Spanish conquerors, disease really helped them. The natives were not immune to these Western diseases, and eventually they collapsed to them. Some important facts to know. So the Muslims were also able to capture part of Western Europe. Cordoba in Spain, as seen there, was conquered by the Umayyads, and the Sufis were a special type of Muslim. They generally had a more syncretic faith with other types of customs, so they weren't perhaps as fundamentalist or traditionalist as other Muslims, but they still adhered to the Muslim faith. Also, the Byzantine Empire, which was the remainder of the Roman Empire after they fell, came to become a rich source of knowledge and trade. And because of all this wealth, they were eventually raided by many different places, among them the Turks, who would eventually take over. In India, the south was generally more stable than the north, and once again, as said, India is always decentralized unless it's not. And for the Americas, all these places required tribute. They required tribute from the people who lived in their empire, and they also required tribute from the surrounding small tribes in the Americas. However, the Spanish ended most of these tribute systems and created their own tribute system where the Spanish were on top. And once again, these people were not really with the rest of the world, that is Eurasia, because they were separated by such a large ocean that most people never crossed before. In sub-Saharan Africa, the Bantu finally kind of stopped moving, then grew different places around Africa, so the Swahili coast, which is over here, over on East Africa, Great Zimbabwe, which is like right there, also there, and Axum, which is like modern-day Ethiopia over here. This was the big hotbed of trade. For the Chinese, 3 new dynasties arose after the Han Dynasty collapsed, the Sui, Tang, and Song dynasties. These three were also started a golden age for China because they constructed many great construction projects that would eventually help to facilitate trade and define China better towards the world. During this time, sort of exclaves of China started as well. Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, or Indochina, started during this time when certain Chinese people migrated outward. In Europe, this was kind of a dead time. So, of course, there was the Eastern Roman Empire that was basically part of the Middle East. This was the Byzantine, and the Western Roman Empire that was collapsing because of outside invaders and deadly diseases. This was also the time of the Middle Ages. So in the early Middle Ages, the Franks and Goths, who were like French and German people, started to really rule, but there wasn't much activity going on because, of course, the big Roman Empire had fallen and most of that activity had disappeared as well. However, during the later half of this time period, the High Middle Ages came, and this was a time for Renaissance and a lot of growth in Western Europe as well. Eventually, these places started to fall again. In Africa, there was a bad environment, and different kingdoms tried to overrun other kingdoms. For the Chinese, they had problems. For example, they couldn't collect taxes very well. They had administrative problems, so the civil service examination wasn't doing too well for them. And also, Mongols eventually came over and took over. For Europe, there were also problems. So the wealthy people at the time didn't want to pay taxes on their land, and this made common people really mad. Outside, Turks and other Muslim groups continued to push Europe to its boundaries, and eventually some parts of it would be overrun. 1200 was a magic year because that marked sort of a shift between the dead Middle Ages and the High Middle Ages, which came the Renaissance and other great times as well for Europe, a great time of new thinking, kind of like what the Greeks did many years before. The Crusades occurred during this time as well, as did the Mongols, who came in and eventually took over much of Western Europe anyways. In China, there were new syncretic faiths, such as Zen Buddhism, Buddhism and Taoism, Neo-Confucianism, Confucianism that was syncretic. Shintoism rose in Japan. This was a blend of animism and other religions such as Buddhism, and also feudal kingdoms started to form where lords were in power, and sinification. Sinification is the process of China spreading all its culture to other places. Ibn Battuta and Mansa Musa were famous Muslims, and Mansa Musa actually ruled Mali and other places in Africa, and he helped to travel and expand Islam in Africa. Ibn Battuta was a scholar who traveled to many places among Africa. He was kind of like the Marco Polo of the times. As mentioned, more world powers started to form during this time. One big one that I skipped on accident was the Holy Roman Empire. This was basically the remainder of the Western Roman Empire. It consisted of the Catholic Church and Pope, and they became basically the strongest force in Western Europe. They were religiously based, and they were able to hold much of the lands against the other random groups that were floating around in Western Europe at the time, such as the Franks and Goths. Religion grew a lot during this time. So, as mentioned, Islam really grew during this time. This was the time where Islam formed, very important for followers of the Muslim faith. Also, Christianity started to syncretize even more and more to try to attract more followers, and eventually it was able to become the number one followed religion in the world. Buddhism also syncretized, as mentioned before, especially shifting from its homeland in India to shift to East Asia and China. Technology once again diffused a lot. Trade, there were new trade networks that occurred. So, as mentioned before, the primary trade network was the Silk Road. But now, when people were able to create ships and new navigation technology, they were able to utilize the Indian Ocean trade, utilize oceans for the first time, and skip over much of the Middle East, and also the Trans-Saharan trade, where Muslim traders were able to finally penetrate into Africa and trade to parts that previously were not inhabited. Also, the Aztec and Inca, they were once again kind of isolated, but when the Spanish came, it truly linked Eurasia with the Americas. China also grew during this time. One important invention during this time was writing and paper. Paper specifically was formed during this time. The Egyptians had like papyrus and other paper, but it wasn't really paper. China really came during this time and instituted paper for much of the Western world. Also, the Grand Canal was created during the Sui dynasty. This was basically the greatest construction project since the Great Wall. Oh, and these dynasties also helped to repair parts of the Great Wall that had previously fallen. Crusades eventually were the end of the Western Roman Empire. The Crusaders wanted to take over much of the Muslim lands because the Muslims were threatening them. So they tried 4 times, but ultimately they weren't really able to succeed, and eventually it helped to take down the Eastern Roman Empire as well, because the two Roman empires were not united, and of course a divided house cannot stand. The famous Abraham Lincoln quote right there. Early modern era, from 1450 to 1750. During this time in the Americas, the old empires that had ruled this region, the Aztecs and Incas, were starting to fall to European powers who were starting to colonize these new lands. In Latin America, so more like South America and Central America, Portugal and Spain were really the two main powers. In North America, there were other European countries such as the English, the French, and the Dutch, who were from the Netherlands. In sub-Saharan Africa, new kingdoms rose as well. The Songhai Empire rose, as did the Congo Empire during this time, and East African city-states that were heavily based on trade rose as well. These were known as the Swahili city-states, and they resided along this east coast of Africa. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Turks took power, and they combined the former Byzantine Empire with much of Arabia, so the Middle East, and some parts of North Africa. In Iran, the Safavids had taken power. They had displaced the people who had come before them. These places eventually fell as well. In the Americas, of course, the empires, the Aztec and Incas, who had previously ruled, were overthrown by Europeans who came over and formed a new hierarchy based on race. In sub-Saharan Africa, there was depopulation because people were being taken away, and also a loss of leadership from the chiefs in these areas. Also, the European trade and Atlantic slave trade contributed heavily to the increase of slavery and removing of many of these people, especially from West Africa, away from the African lands. In the Middle East, Russians and Ottomans were outside invaders that tried to come in, and other times, these empires were not very stable because their rulers had trouble trying to lead their people. Some other facts to know were that there was different types of rule in the Americas. So while Spain and Portugal instituted a heavily race-based society, while the French tried to trade with the natives and the British just tried to isolate and just pretend the natives weren't there, these would eventually cause all sorts of problems in the future as well. In Africa, African colonization eventually, as mentioned, gave rise to this big slave trade. And in the Middle East, new gunpowder empires arose to become big military forces during this time in world history. In South Asia, the main groups were the Mughals. They took over India and Pakistan. While in Europe, in Eastern Europe, we had the rise of the Russians and Mongols again, so this kind of overlaps with Middle East. And in West, we have the formation of many modern countries that we see today. So Spain, Portugal, England, France, Netherlands, and the Holy Roman Empire would eventually dissolve and become Germany. In East Asia, China had 2 more dynasties during this time period, the Ming and the Qing dynasty, which was really just Manchus coming in and taking over. Japan also became more sophisticated during this time. They had the Tokugawa shogunate, which occurred during the Edo period. It was a time of relative prosperity for them. However, these places fell as well. The Mughals fell because of corruption within, and also British and French imperialism. They were trying to come in and take over India. Western Europe, of course, continued to the next period. And China started to fall because of civil unrest, and of course, Manchus are not real Chinese people, so the real Chinese people started to resent the Manchus and eventually helped to kick them out. In Japan, there was civil unrest, and the emperor was once again restored to try to take over. So the Islamic gunpowder empires included the Mughals from South Asia, and also the Ottomans and Safavids from the Middle East. These 3 would eventually form big armies and become a big military force during this time. In Europe, Russia really grew during this time. Kiev was not a major Russian trading city since it was destroyed, but Moscow and St. Pete were big trading cities during this time because, of course, outsiders didn't completely destroy them. And since they were like the central parts of Europe and Asia, they were able to facilitate lots of trade. The Russians were also powerful militarily. They had Cossacks, which were fierce peasant warriors that fought for them. The Spanish Armada was the biggest navy in the world at the time, and they were also a highly powerful force until they were defeated by the British. And the Manchus forced the Chinese to wear a queue that's like a braid for men, and it was seen as an inferior symbol, and eventually the communists, when they took power of China, ordered these braids to be cut. So this is also known as the Age of Exploration from 1450 to 1750 because of all these new shippings and technologies that started to come about. People could really start to traverse the oceans like they were never able to do before. As many historians also say, this is a transition time between sort of like an old world and a new world, when finally Eurasia has been linked with America. Most prominent during this time, we see the high rise of Europe, as mentioned, and the Holy Roman Empire becoming not as mighty, but becoming a rather powerful state of Germany that would eventually conquer much of Europe as well. This was also the age of centralized power, an age of absolutism where rulers and monarchs took absolute control. Democracy and democratic ideals were really low during this time, especially low. While some places, such as France and the Netherlands, did start to have some constitutional monarchies and republics, the majority of the world still resorted to absolutism. Mercantilism also grew as joint stock companies really grew during this time, tried to imperialize and gain more money. And the Protestant Reformation occurred during this time as well, trying to reform the corrupted Catholic Church. It was started by Martin Luther, of course. Transatlantic trade was big. Trade started, and triangular trade started. This was between Africa, Europe, and the Americas. These three continents and areas all had different roles in this whole new global trade network. The Middle Passage was a very deadly route that slaves undertook to travel to the Americas, where a large percentage of them died on the way over. And the Columbian Exchange sort of talks about the exchange of new crops between the Americas and Europe, how crops that Europeans had never seen before, such as tomatoes, came over. So tomatoes aren't actually Italian. And certain diseases such as smallpox and horses and other animals that the natives had never seen before started to come over to the Americas. We have this big intermingling of cultures and also goods that were never existent in the other continent before. Cash crops and luxury items were also big trade things during this time. Many people wanted to grow cash crops, especially the Spanish and Portuguese on plantations, because it was a good way to make money. But these luxury items were, of course, only sold to the extremely rich. Many people in this time in world history were still really poor, so of course they couldn't afford these luxury items, such as sugar at the time.